Hi, John.
Hi, Bob. It's good to
How
be
are
with
you?
you. Good to be with you.
Well, thanks for taking the time. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available in both streaming video and audio podcasts. You are John Haught, a professor at Georgetown, and also a Catholic theologian, I think it's fair to say, with both an uppercase C and a
Right.
lowercase c. You
Right.
in the sense that you draw on an unusual number of sources with your theology, and in particular, I have to say, you engage science more fully than pretty much any theologian I'm aware of these days. And in fact, you and I had a conversation that's still online. We were trying to remember how long ago it was, maybe 18 years, on your book, God After Darwin, A Theology of Evolution. And you've written a number of books since then, most recently, The New Cosmic Story, Inside Our Awakening Universe. We're going to talk about that today, published last year by Yale University Press. You know, it's got a lot of dimensions. I think I'd like to start with a very non-theological one, and say that it fits into a genre, and you place it into a genre that is known as a secular genre. That's a genre known as big history.
Big history.
Bill Gates has gotten enthusiastic about this, and he's embraced a version of it by a guy named David Christian. Whose last name notwithstanding, I think produces a pretty much a secular version of
right, and deliberately so, yes.
And you say some things early on. Now, big history is just the biggest history you can imagine, from the Big Bang to kind of now, certainly involving human, the origin of life, human beings. But you have a couple of you note a couple of things that distinguish your book from the genre of big history as it's currently conceived, right?
Yes. Big history tries as best it can to cover everything that's happened in the past, and that would mean today, in the light of cosmology and science, that would go back as far as the Big Bang, if not earlier, and then move forward from there. And I just want to say at the outset, I accept everything that big history does, but I have objections to what it leaves out, and that's what I call the inside story of the universe. It does a very good job of covering the outside story, but following the methodological constraints of scientific method deliberately, it refuses to talk about things like subjectivity, values, meanings, and so forth, since science is a method that deliberately leaves these things out. If you follow that method, then you get only the outside story. So what I'm looking for is acknowledgement that there's something else going on inside the universe, the inside story, which consists of the experience of what I call subjects, centers of experience, not just humans, but going all the way back. And then in the light of astrophysics today, acknowledging that there's a prehistory to subjectivity, which has to be very specifically defined in order for subjectivity ever to arise in the universe, in order for consciousness to come about. The physics of the universe has to be of such a nature as to allow for that. And so, virtually speaking, I consider all that prehistory, all the cosmic history, all the billions of years before subjects actually emerged in history, to be still part of that interior story, or that inside story of the universe.
Yeah. Can I pause and just make an observation about a thing you hear? You tell me how closely related this is to your critique of this one critique you have of big history, which is, you sometimes hear people say, do not exalt the human species or even the primates or life or anything, because in the scheme of things, we're nothing. Look at the vastness of the universe. Look at the vastness of time that preceded us. And I always want to say, no, I'm sorry, but we're special. I mean, it is like something to be us. We have subjective experience. You could argue that the universe has no meaning unless there are things that have subjective experience. So is that related to your your point?
Yes, but I want to talk about the universe primarily, but what I'm saying is we can't really talk about the universe objectively by leaving out the most intense version of subjectivity that has occurred in this cosmos, and that's, as far as we know, human consciousness. So my objective is not anthropocentrism by any means, but I'm cosmocentric, but I'm saying we can't understand the universe at all, at least very well, if we leave out one of the most significant developments, that emerald of evolution that we call consciousness.
Right. And then you alluded, if I understood you correctly, you alluded to kind of the prehistory of consciousness, or the establishing of the prerequisites for consciousness. That's an important part of the
Yeah, that's where the evolutionary biology comes in, all that. But also today, over the last 50 years, we realized that we can't really understand the story of life very well unless we tell the whole story of the universe, because it's webbed into it in ways that we didn't see until quite recently.
So I gather a second critique of yours of big history is insufficient attention to the kind of continuity you see between what you could call is it prebiotic or something? I mean, the part that's conventionally thought of as before the advent of life, and the living part you see as more continuous than some.
And I want to see it primarily as a narrative continuity. My observation of modernity in general is that intellectuals in modern history still don't believe, or never have fully believed, that they are part of the universe. They will admit it metaphysically. Metaphysical materialist monism obviously sees us as part of the universe, but epistemologically speaking, when we do our thinking, we somehow presuppose that our thought, our intelligent subjectivity, is not really part of the natural world. I think that's the elephant in the room in so much discussion of the question of whether the universe has meaning, what religion signifies, what religion is, and that's something I do want to emphasize: continuity. There's physical continuity too, but also narrative continuity.
Okay. So with those two kind of distinctions between your worldview and the and existing big history, let's get a little theological without yet really confronting the thrust of your argument. Just by looking at the backdrop a little and talking a little about someone whose ideas I think you emphasize inform yours. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin,
yes,
right? Mm-hmm. The Catholic theologian and paleontologist, and I think most would say mystic, mm-hmm. Who wrote in the early part of the 20th century. What do you want to tell people who may not have heard of him?
Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He was a Jesuit priest born in 1855, died in 1955, born in 1881. When he was a young man, he had to develop a skill in a certain secular field, so he chose geology. He loved rocks since the time he was a kid, and he became one of the great geologists and paleontologists in his lifetime of the Asian continent. He spent 25 years of his life in China and had a sterling reputation as a scientist. So he knows very, very definitely what outside history is, what scientific history is. And he doesn't confuse science. His scientific papers don't have anything religious about them. He did write a book called The Phenomenon of Man, now translated as The Human Phenomenon, in which somewhat unfortunately said he wanted to stick to a scientific approach. But by that, he didn't mean strict science. He meant a widely empirical approach, which takes into account everything that's going on in the universe. And he said it's just obvious that his own thought, our own thinking, our subjectivity is just as much a part of the universe as rocks and rivers. So he wanted to develop a cosmology. In fact, I consider him to be the first really big historian, because he said we can't tell the outside story of the universe without also telling simultaneously the inside. Otherwise, we give a false impression of what the universe is. Mm-hmm. And it's in terms of that he develops his own science of nature, theology of nature, mm-hmm. in which he integrates his religious thought into his scientific thought without conflating them and without merging them into a smudge. He keeps them distinct, but at the same time, he thinks they're both parts of a story, and both sides of the story need to be told, outside and inside.
Mm-hmm. And one feature of his thought was the way it integrated the development of technology into the human story in a way that I think in retrospect looks prescient. I mean, he saw, in his day, the big, I guess, TV existed, certainly radio existed, the internet didn't. And yet he kind of saw that there was something developing that he compared to like a global nervous system or a global brain. He used the term noosphere, Noosphere. I don't think that's original to him, but he kind of made it famous to refer to what he called the thinking envelope of the Earth. The idea was that humankind was evolving into something a little reminiscent of a superorganism, but in any event, an increasingly kind of unified thing in his hopes, at least, and in his theology. And he saw. I think he envisioned a kind of outpouring of brotherly love or something that would kind of consolidate or cement.
I would say that he looked upon this development of the noosphere by way of technology, communications technology in particular, but also engineering, economics, politics, the whole thing that's going on the face of our planet. He didn't look at it simply as a human phenomenon, but as a cosmic phenomenon. It's a new chapter in cosmic history. And it's, of course, being done proximately by us, but we are ourselves expressions of the universe. So it's fundamentally a cosmic development. And we should look at that, too, when we ask the question, what is this universe all about? And he sees the noosphere as an example of how the universe has always, and probably will continue to be, open to bringing about new and unpredictable possibilities into the story as the cosmic history goes on. There's no reason why we should assume that humans, once we evolved, are the end of cosmic history. We are a part of a much larger, more wonderful story, but there's a danger to it as well, as you indicated implicitly there. And unless we practice a certain virtue among ourselves, unless that still remains, and we learn that from the religions primarily, especially the virtue of love, unless that is practiced, then the whole thing is going to fall apart. So in a way, the future of the cosmic process does depend upon the integrity of our ethics, of our morals, our virtue, and implicitly our religions.
Yeah, and he emphasized this kind of growth in biological complexity and that we had seen as being a manifestation of something fundamental in the universe, and biological organization rising to higher and higher levels. I think the phrase "everything that rises must converge" is his. And then again, he saw technology as sustaining what was fundamentally a unified trend toward higher levels of complexity, and he emphasized that was the exterior view, but the real significance was what he called the interior, the growth of the complexity of subjective experience, and so on. Right?
Yeah, he even said we need a new physics, which includes the inside as well as the outside. Not that he's asking physicists to do that themselves, but we need a new cosmology, is what he's saying. That's more radically empirical, that takes into account all the data of experience, not just objects, but subjective experience as well. And what arises in this internal vein of subjectivity, namely a kind of aspiration on the part of the universe, and I call it anticipation of what we normally refer to as the transcendentals in philosophy of goodness, truth, beauty, and make that part of cosmic history, so that through us, through our attraction to these values, the whole cosmic history is taken up into a new chapter, as it were. And so it's very hopeful vision. I wouldn't say optimistic, but hopeful, in the sense that it offers possibilities for future cosmic evolution that we don't have as long as we think of the cosmos as fundamentally mindless, lifeless, objective, massive, indifferent, impersonal stuff.
Did he even see I mean, today you're hearing more and more about panpsychism, the view that subjective experience is embedded in at least some degree in all physical phenomena. Would he have qualified as a panpsychist who thought that in that subjective experience preceded life?
I don't think I would call him a panpsychist, but he would say that, narratively speaking, there is an incipient insideness or withinness or subjectivity that's present in the cosmos from its very opening moments. Mm-hmm. He lived during the time that Einstein and general relativity was coming into prominence. So he said what we have to get into our heads, whether we're religious or not, is that the universe now has to be thought of as a story, an unfolding story. Mm-hmm. And a story for him is something that's capable of carrying a meaning. Throughout human history, the way in which humans have communicated meaning and felt meaning in their own lives is through the telling of stories. Mm-hmm. Well, now we have a really novel situation in which the whole cosmos, we now realize, on the basis of scientific discovery itself, has a narrative, or I like to call it a dramatic quality to it that we didn't see before. So once you see the universe like that, then everything looks different, everything in the universe, and especially things in the world of religion, but culture in general. Virtue looks different. The idea of God looks different. God is no longer the governor so much as the goal of this process. And so what I try to do in the book is go through a number of different features of religion, 12 different characteristics of religion, and show how they look so different now when we put them in the context of a cosmic story.
Yeah, when you say God is more like the goal, I think Teilhard said something like God is less in the alpha than the
God
omega.
God is both alpha and omega, but God is more.
Omega point was a kind of culmination. Yeah, sorry, I was talking over you. What'd you say?
Well, he says God is both alpha and omega, but God is more omega than alpha.
Okay.
In other words, and another way he puts that is to say the world rests on the future as its sole support. And by that he means things don't really become fully actualized or fully intelligible until we let them play themselves out. When you look at the universe as a story, the kind of intelligibility you look for in a story is one of narrative coherence, mm-hmm. not just mathematical or geometrical excellence, which is what science looks at. There are different ways of seeking intelligibility in the universe.
Okay. And so, and here I'm asking about your view, not his so much, but to talk about God as being, in the omega. Is that to say that God is the divine is evolving? The divine is maturing, or
there's a sense even in Orthodox traditional Christian thought in which the specifically Christian understanding of God, which is given to Christians are said not to think about God without thinking about the man Jesus, so that what happens to Jesus happens to God. So there's a deep basis in Christian teaching from the very beginning that God is affected. God is changed, you might say, by what happens in the cosmos. And that's the way of saying the universe matters to God. It's not just his plaything. It's something that somehow contributes something to, as Teilhard says, something to the identity, to the way he puts it, something that contributes to the texture of the kingdom of heaven, if you want to put it that way. Another way of saying it is that somehow what happens in the cosmos affects the divine without in any way diminishing the divine. In traditional thought and pre-scientific thought, there was an attempt on the part of most theology to protect God from the becoming, which also included the perishing that goes on in the world. So there wasn't much talk for centuries about the idea of God being affected by the world. In fact, Thomas Aquinas said that God does not have an ontological relationship with the world. And what they're trying to do is to protect the divine transcendence from getting lost in the perishable universe. Mm-hmm. But in a post-scientific age, the new understanding of God are possible, in which the transcendence of God consists of God's absolute relationality to the world. I mean, theologians today would say, for example, that God, there's a whole hierarchy of relationships. A stone is minimally related to its environment. A plant is more related to it. because it puts its roots down into the soil. Right. Then an animal can be even more related, can roam around in a wide, complex ecological niche and form a much closer relationship to the world. Humans are almost incapable of any kind of amount of relationships. They're also capable of great selfishness and unrelatedness as well. But in that way of thinking, God is transcendent in the sense that God is the absolute related one to the world. And that way you can preserve the notion that God is affected by what happens in the cosmos, but at the same time, because the relationship is unrestricted or absolute, you can preserve the notion of divine transcendence as well. So theology's changed a lot. You don't hear this in the suburban pulpit, but there's a lot that's been going on since the beginning of the scientific revolution in theology, whereby theology has fully accepted what goes on in science, including Darwinian evolution.
Okay, so in this view, it certainly isn't pantheism, in other words, just equating God with the universe, but at the same time, there's such a close relationship that is the universe almost like part of God's sensory apparatus or something?
Sometimes theologians use the new word panentheism. Right. God does not identify with all, but all is somehow, in the Greek word for all is pan, all is somehow in God and is transformed by God. And in that sense, in the same sense that a mother is affected by what happens in the life of her child without being diminished in any way. In fact, it is made more significant by virtue of the capacity to relate to the suffering of a child. In contemporary Christian theology, God is thought of as one who takes the suffering as well as the struggle, the whole story of the cosmos into the divine life, and is changed in that sense without in any way being diminished by what happens in cosmic history.
Okay. So if I understand your book correctly, you believe that the interior life, subjective experience, is latent in the universe from the beginning? Narratively
so, yes. And so what happens later in the cosmos when life comes about and mind comes about is specifically related to the whole history of material and energetic turmoil and transformation, going back to sidereal events, going back all the way to the Big Bang. We have today so much more detail about the physics, the specific qualities and values of physical factors, conditions, fundamental constants that allowed the universe to come alive. So all of that is narratively continuous with the development of subjectivity. So what I'm saying is we never really lived, there never was such a thing as an essentially lifeless and mindless universe. And even if there happen to be many other universes, I see them as still narratively, statistically connected to the story of the evolution of life, mind, subjectivity, and faith in our own universe. It's all one large story whose parameters we are expanding in our minds and in our research all the time.
Okay. So the universe has a mind, in your view, and this is something I think you think is insufficiently appreciated. There's a sense in which the universe has a mind. Subjective experience is kind of built into it, even if it doesn't manifest itself very richly for a while. But in any event, we are now part of the evolving mind of the universe.
Yes, but I would prefer to use the word awakening, that we live in an awakening universe, and that this awakening has come about gradually, but the universe, the physics of the early universe is part of that story of awakening. Awakening begins to occur in life itself in a much more dramatic way than before, because life, by definition, in order to be alive, has to be a striving. It has to follow what you might call a logic of achievement, which means it can not only succeed, but it can also fail. So an element of tragedy or drama enters into the cosmos with the very first coming about of living organisms. And it becomes more and more intense, the drama does, when life becomes conscious. And when our striving includes especially searching for meaning, for truth, for beauty, and and acceptance. So the universe has become increasingly dramatic as it awakens. And then what I like to do is to put the whole phenomenon of religion, now that we have a cosmic story as the backdrop for our discussion of things going on, to see religion not just as something that humans do on the face of the earth, either to escape from it or adapt to it or whatever, but I like to see faith or religion, and this is a Teilhardian insight, as the more recent way in which the universe has undergone another stage of awakening. But I also emphasize in the book that religion is not just awakening to what I call rightness. It's also shadowed, since we live in an unfinished universe, an unperfected universe. There are deep shadows. There's room for a great deal of evil and monstrosity in religion, as well as in cosmic history in general. And the key theme in all this is to keep in mind throughout that we live in a universe that is still coming into being. And logically, that means that we can't expect it to reveal itself fully here and now. And I see scientific naturalism, as well as much traditional religion, as a kind of impatience that looks for absolute clarity in the here and now and makes decisions that the universe is or is not absurd, or the cosmic pessimism is or is not the most intelligent approach to take. I see all that as kind of a premature judgment once you realize that we might be very, very early in the unfolding of this drama of awakening. Mm-hmm. And that the only realistic way to approach a story that's unfinished is to adopt a disposition of patience, of waiting, because intelligibility in a novel or a drama or a story does not display itself fully on the first page or in the first act. You have to approach it with bridled expectation, and that's what I see as the fundamental virtue that the Abrahamic religions were trying to inculcate in us. So only those who wait will not be disappointed. And so I find that to be epistemologically a very realistic approach to take once you realize that the universe is not just a state, not just a place, not just a stage, but it's a drama itself. Mm-hmm. So patience is absolutely necessary to be realistic about what's going on in this cosmic process.
Okay. I have trouble with patience, but I don't doubt that it's
I'm probably trying your patience.
Patience as it stands now. So as you suggested, I think a big part of the book is putting religion in cosmic context, right, and arguing that religion viewed in cosmic context is a very significant development
in the universe.
Another thing you spend a lot of time on, and that you relate to the significance of religion, is the idea of rightness, rightness. Now, I think most people, they hear that word, the first thing they think of is like moral rightness, like a sense of right and wrong, like, mm-hmm, Adam and Eve in the tree of, having knowledge of good and evil and having a sense of moral judgment. Yeah. Do you mean, and of course there are people who would say, well, you don't need religion for that, but do you mean more than that by the word rightness?
Much more. And you, as a scholar of Buddhism, realize that for the Buddhists, rightness means much more than moral rightness. There's right wisdom, right associations, right mindfulness. So rightness is a term that came into religion very early. In Hebrew religion, it's translated as sometimes righteousness or justice. So that in Hebrew religion, rightness does mean the practice of justice. So it's a very ethical meaning in that sense. But the ground of justice is rightness itself. That's a combination of goodness plus infinite beauty, plus infinite truth, plus unity. So what traditionally philosophers have referred to as the transcendentals. In biblical religion, you add a fourth, namely futurity. God is the one who has future as God's very essence. So the rightness is something that manifests itself only from the future. And it's not just moral, it's physical, it's aesthetic, it's spiritual.
So beauty is part of beauty is part of rightness.
Definitely so. Definitely so. Yes. And I think if you look at traditional, even Christian religion, you'll see that that the notion of beauty has been tied into the notion of God, but theology and practical Christianity has not brought this theme out. Although, incidentally, Pope Francis, in his new encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, makes beauty the end and purpose of the universe and uses that as a kind of cosmological framework to justify an ecological ethic. The meaning of our own lives, in other words, has something to do with the upholding and the contribution, and also, I would say, the creation of beauty. So rightness, when we look at a picture and say it's wrong or right, we use rightness not just ethically and morally, but aesthetically also, and spiritually and philosophically.
Okay. And, I said there are people who would say you don't need religion to have a sense of right and wrong. There are people who say you don't need religion to have a sense of beauty and ugly and the various other. So what are you, so elaborate on how you're associating religion with awareness of rightness or awakening to rightness.
Well, I do make the point that you don't have to be religious to have a sense of rightness in any of the senses that I've talked about. But what I do argue, though, is that a purely materialistic worldview, a purely analytical, I call it archaeonomic worldview that tries to reduce everything to granular past, to subatomic stuff, that's not enough of a worldview to justify our own trusting of our sense of rightness. We all have a sense of rightness, and we should, and rightly so. But I want a worldview that justifies that sense of rightness. And to me, the materialist worldview does not do so. I can't go into the whole complex argument here, but this is why I reject it as not really bringing intelligibility to one of the most important themes in our lives, namely, even when an atheist scientist is giving us his or her ideas, they trust the capacity of their minds to get in touch with rightness, with right thinking, with right method, with right goodness and right action and so forth. So there's a spontaneous commitment on the part of human consciousness to the anticipation, I call it, of rightness. And what I want is a worldview, a universe which justifies that anticipation of rightness that all of us have. And I don't find that justification in a purely scientific materialist or scientific naturalist view, which says that nature, as known by science, is all there is. Because science does not know all there is to nature. There's this insideness that I'm talking about that's been part of nature. And this insideness really breaks through the surface when human consciousness comes along in its own search for right understanding, for right attentiveness, right mindfulness, and right thinking, and right goodness, and right beauty.
Yeah, so, you distinguish in the book between science and scientific materialism. Scientific. You're not like anti-science.
Not at all. In fact, I love science.
And in saying it can't deal with all phenomena, I assume that what you're, at least one thing you're referring to, maybe the main thing, and maybe all you're referring to is the fact that science depends on the public observation of events. Right. The idea is that two different people can observe the measurement and agree that, well, this is what the thermometer said, and the physical phenomenon that the thermometer is measuring, they both can see. And of course, subjective experience is only observable by one being. And that's a big part of what you're emphasizing in kind of sketching out the limits of science?
Well, let me back up lest I be misunderstood here. I want science to have access to everything, and I want science to explore everything, including religion, including psychological states, including human consciousness as much as it can from its particular methodological perspective. So I don't want to make a division between what's accessible to science and what is accessible to theology. I want science to have access to everything. I just suggest that what science will find through its own methodological filter is going to leave out things that what other methodological approaches, other methodologies would find, including religion and theology.
And including phenomenology, I guess, right?
Yes. My whole way of doing science and religion is to start with the idea that there can be an almost endless plurality of levels of understanding or explanation. And the example that I have often used with my students was, maybe you've heard this before, that suppose somebody's boiling water in the kitchen and somebody comes in and says, why is that water boiling? And you can explain it, well, because the molecules are moving around excitedly, making the transition from the liquid state to the gaseous state. And that's why the water is boiling. Or you could also say it's boiling because my wife turned the gas on. Or you could also say it's boiling because I want tea. My point is those are non-competing levels of explanation. And there's no violation of Occam's razor here, because Occam's razor has to do only with competing explanations, right, not with non-competing explanations.
Right.
So I want theology and science to be understood as different ways of searching for the intelligibility that the cosmos is presenting to us vaguely. Mm-hmm. And I think theology works on the assumption that narrative coherence is a form of intelligibility that we are justified in looking for when we look at the cosmos as a story, along with the kind of intelligibility that Einstein and Galileo and Darwin and the others look for. I want to make room for all these different levels. The mischief occurs only when one level assumes that it's going to do the work of all the levels of explanation. Mm-hmm. And that's happened both on the part of religious people as well as on the part of scientists.
Yeah, another application of this idea of non-competing explanations of the same thing, which I think enters your book, is with the idea of purpose. I mean, you could say, Teilhard de Chardin would say, if you ask, why is evolution tending in this direction toward greater and greater complexity, which isn't to say, by the way, that that all organisms at all times are moving that direction, but the net drift is in that direction.
Well, there has been, I don't think anybody would deny this, an emergent physical complexity. Organized complexity has increased over time, over billions of years in the cosmos. And that as it has increased, especially now that it has made the leap into thought out of the complex nervous system and human brain of humans, the universe has become conscious. So it's a pretty good universe, in other words, that can allow consciousness to emerge.
Right.
But I don't want to use that as the sole criterion of purpose. By purpose, I mean orientation toward the realization of something that's self-evidently valuable or good. For example, we think of our own lives as having purpose if they're oriented toward bringing about something we consider good, like peace, justice, and so forth. The question that has been raised ever since the birth of science is whether in some analogous way we can say that the cosmos is in some way realizing some value.
And the only point I was making was that if you asserted that there is a cosmic purpose unfolding, or divine purpose, or however you want to describe it, and that is one way of answering the question of why evolution tends toward complexity, that does not exclude the truth of saying, well, it's evolving because natural selection has these properties, and the mechanics of natural selection just lead to greater complexity. Yeah. It's not these are mutually, in principle, can be compatible claims.
Exactly. Yes, and I don't want in any way to diminish the importance of evolutionary explanations. In fact, I think I'm known as a theologian who fully embraces neo-Darwinian evolution. And so there can be no mistaking of my intentions in that regard. But people somehow assume that if you also have, in addition to that theological interest, that's somehow going to interfere with the kind of method, the purity of method you use when you do physics, biology, chemistry, and so forth. In no way do I think theology ever has to diminish the purity of scientific ways of investigating. But it does oppose explanatory monism. Explanatory monism is the view that only one kind of explanation is valid and true. And I think the modern world has been deeply vitiated by a kind of explanatory monism. And I don't think it's necessary at all.
Okay. Now, so to get back briefly to this idea of rightness, I gather that one thing you're saying is that if you look at the development of religions, and not only Christianity, but religions, they are particularly robust vehicles for the exploration of rightness, the development of an attentiveness to rightness, the articulation of ideas about rightness in the various senses of rightness. Yeah. Is that
yes, and what makes religion distinct is its insistence that rightness is real, and even more real than anything else.
Right.
And that therefore rightness is not something we made up simply as a psychological crutch, or simply to coat over an impersonal universe with a kind of warmth of meaning that it doesn't have. But religions say, in general, not just religions, but philosophical wisdom too. Plato made the distinction between opinion and truth. Taoism talks about the rightness in terms of the Tao. Egyptian religion in terms of Ma'at. There's a word for rightness, an explicit word for rightness in almost all the great traditions. And that's what I'm talking about. Religion does, as you suggest, cultivate this sense of rightness in a way that you don't find in other expressions of human culture. Mm-hmm. And I want to make room for that, because I think personally that only if rightness is real can we justify the trust that we place in our own minds as we look for right thinking, mm-hmm. and right action and right beauty and so forth. Mm-hmm. That we need a worldview that justifies that trust.
And so,
otherwise,
Go ahead.
No, otherwise, the other option is to try to explain these later developments fully in terms of their atomic constituency. And that's the same thing as reducing them to deadness. So I don't want an ontology of death to be the intellectual foundation of the things that we value most. And I'm afraid that so much philosophy and journalism does that today. And I object to that, not just for spiritual reasons, but for logical reasons. Mm-hmm.
But are you fine with explanations that might be seen as reductionist, so long as they are not taken to preclude a more transcendent or transcendental or whatever it is, truth of, reality of right? Yes. So in other words, an evolutionary psychologist would say, we can explain how why people came to talk about things being right and wrong, and how there was even what you could call progress in their conception of that, and we can explain that, blah, blah, blah. And your point would be, I don't deny that.
Not only that, I promote it. I foster it. And your book, for example, The Moral Animal, mm-hmm. Was an attempt to understand morality from an evolutionary point of view, and I applaud that. It's just that after I read the book, I say, well, this is one approach, and mm-hmm. it has brought a certain intelligibility to morality that we didn't have before Darwin. So not only am I tolerant of this, I actively promote reductive methodology. We would not, for example, have known that the universe is a story were it not for analytical reductive science itself. So I'm very appreciative of everything science does. It's just at the end of the day, I want to say, well, this is part of the story.
Well, and I assume you're saying that, okay, fine, that may be at a mechanistic level the way it happened, but you are further asserting that there is an alignment between certain conceptions of rightness that we wound up with through this intelligible process, an alignment between that and in some sense, transcendent truth. Right?
Yes, exactly. I apply my notion of layered explanation to morality. Why do humans have a tendency toward virtue or morality? You can approach it from an evolutionary point of view and push that explanation horizontally as far as you possibly can. Or you can also be a Kantian, which would not necessarily disagree with that, and say because somehow it's in some level of our being, a moral law is planted in us. I don't like the Kantian way of doing that. I prefer a more Teilhardian way. We are inclined to be virtuous because we're part of a universe which is awakening to goodness. So that's a whole other level, but it's completely logically compatible with an evolutionary explanation of morality, such as you provide.
Okay.
In your work.
Now, in addition to emphasizing rightness a lot, you emphasize unfinishedness.
Yes.
Right? The fact that the universe isn't finished, that religion isn't finished.
Since religion is webbed into the universe, religion is not finished either.
It is not mature, neither are mature. So talk a little more about that and why that matters to you.
Well, in order to do that, I have to talk about three different ways of reading the universe. Now that we know the universe is a story, we can read the story by trying to explain everything that's going on now in terms of what happened in the past. And that's a legitimate way of reading the story. I call that the archaeological or the archaeonomic way of looking at the story. There's also the traditional pre-scientific view, which I call the analogical view. That's the Platonic view, that everything that we see in nature is somehow a dim reflection of a perfect archetype in the mind of God. And that way of thinking has been prevalent in religion up until the scientific revolution. But there's also what I call an anticipatory way of reading the universe. And just as the analytical way has a figure in antiquity, Democritus, as its banner carrier, and the analogical has the figure of Plato, there's a whole worldview contained in Abrahamic religion, which I call the anticipatory worldview. And that's the view that if you want to know what reality is about, you have to wait for the future to come. And that means that you have to accept the fact that right now the universe is unfinished. So I find a kind of neat correspondence, or consonance, you might say, between the new astrophysical sense of a universe which is still coming into being and a faith system which itself says the only way we can get at the really real is to adopt this attitude of patience, which another name for which is faith. For me, faith is not belief without evidence, as the new atheists understand it. Faith is allowing yourself to be grasped by the future. That's the biblical understanding. That's the Abrahamic way. And it carries up through the New Testament, Jesus, Paul, and Christianity in general. But Christianity lost touch with this anticipatory biblical way of understanding reality and went over to Plato. This is why Nietzsche in the 19th century said Christianity is just Platonism for the people. There's a certain truth to that. But recently, what I find exciting is that this notion of an unfinished universe allows us to retrieve an anticipatory worldview that we had in Christian theology, much to the detriment of Christianity, lost touch with over the course of many centuries. And so what an unfinished universe means, and I think it's a scientific fact that the universe is still going on, and we can't rule out the possibility that many surprises await it in the future. That logically speaking, a process which is unfinished means unperfected. So that rules out a Platonic perfectionism. Mm-hmm. And it also rules out the idea that you can understand the present simply in terms of the atomic or subatomic past. It rules out a reductionist metaphysics as well. So what's left is, to me, an anticipatory view, which makes both scientific sense and religious sense. An unfinished universe means unperfected. If it's unperfected, it's not perfect. And if it's not perfect, then there's a shadow side to an unperfected universe. Religion is part of this unfinished universe. Religion has a deep shadow side. It's, as Whitehead says, religion came into cultures closely attached to barbarisms that we sometimes fail to acknowledge, and to hatred and to monstrosity and cruelty. But yet there is this facet of religion which is concerned with rightness. And that's what I want to signal out and correlate that with the notion of an unfinished universe.
Okay, so you mentioned Whitehead. That's Alfred North Whitehead, who is associated with, well, first of all, he co-authored Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell. He was a pretty serious intellectual, I guess it's safe to say.
Yes,
neither of us understands enough about Principia Mathematica to say for sure, but it was no trivial piece of work, whatever its status wound up being.
Right.
And but also he's associated with process philosophy and, I guess, to some extent, process theology, and that has a kind of relationship to your worldview, right? So
yes,
tell us what.
Well, he had an anticipatory worldview too.
Yeah.
First of all, though, I think his most important work is Science in the Modern World, where he goes into his critique of modern scientific materialism. And the critique of it is essentially that it's too abstract. It leaves out most of what's going on in the real world. And then it identifies its mathematical abstractions with reality. And that is the great fallacy, call it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that has affected the whole modern age. And I used to teach science and religion at Georgetown, and I often use that book just to get across to the students that what is taken as scientifically real or concretely real is oftentimes very, very abstract. So one of the things that it has left out is the poetic. He was a big fan of Wordsworth, but also the religious way of reading the universe. And as he got older, he went through periods of skepticism, religious skepticism in his own life. But as he got older, after he came to the United States, he started talking more about God. And I think some of his philosophical associates thought that he had, become senile or something.
One of the warning signs.
He did it very deliberately, because by God, he said he meant the goal, the aim of the universe is toward the intensification of beauty.
Right.
So much of my own thinking about rightness I owe to my reading of Whitehead over the years, because I think he was right to point out that beauty is just as much part of reality. It's not something we project onto the universe. The universe is patterned in different ways, and what beauty is the harmony of contrasts, the unifying of multiplicity. So the cosmos itself is not just subjectively speaking, but objectively speaking, the universe is a work of beauty. And he thought that we could bring science and religion into useful conversation if we recognize that science is a way of approaching this world that abstracts from that aesthetic dimension to a great extent, although it does include it. Einstein, for example, thought that if something is beautiful, it must be true. So there is an aesthetic thing, a search for aesthetic rightness that underlies scientific inquiry as well. And this is why I don't want to make these things exclusively religious. The search for rightness permeates thought, but in different ways. In religion, rightness, the beauty is thought of as really real, not something that we impose on the universe, but something that the universe is aiming toward and is realizing in an incomplete way at any moment.
Although if there weren't us in the generic sense of beings of subjective complexity, there would be much less in the way of appreciation of beauty.
Of course, but beauty would not be entirely absent. But before we came along, there were subjects, animals, and others whom I think we're increasingly recognizing as having an aesthetic sensitivity. There's a nice book written just this past spring on the beauty of nature from an evolutionary point of view. So it's there long before we come out. But we do have a way of interacting with the natural world that has a kind of complexity and intense, Whitehead uses the term aesthetic intensity to it, that we don't find necessarily in other modes of subjective interaction with the world.
Yeah. One more question about Whitehead that may or may not relate to your what you want to emphasize here, but the term process philosophy and process theology, I gather, refers to this idea that events, that ultimately at some kind of metaphysical level, events are more fundamental than things. Now, we intuitively think of, like, in a sense, as things are fundamental and then events happen to them. Like there's my light bulb and then my light bulb breaks or something. Right. This event happened to the thing, but the thing was there before the event. Now, Whitehead, and I think this is kind of an Eastern sounding idea in some way, that events are more fundamental than things. It's a hard thing to wrap your mind around. Yeah. Is that an important?
Yes, as long as we thought of the universe as stationary and immobile, it was easy to grind it down into tiny little chunks of stuff. But once we realized, as we do now, that the universe is a process that starts with geology, then becomes more intense with biology, evolutionary biology, and now with cosmology and astrophysics, we realize that the whole universe is a process. The constituents of a process are not atomic slugs of stuff, but they are happenings, occurrences, events. So the most appropriate way to break down our universe into atomic constituents is to look upon them as energy events rather than imagine immobile or stationary marbles or particles in motion, as it were. And once you do that, then the universe it's easier to see the universe as a story, as a narrative, as an accumulation of a series of happenings over the course of time. And the nice thing about events, unlike particles dissolve and scatter, but events keep adding up. They keep accumulating. So that in some sense, the Big Bang, even though it happened 13.8 billion years ago, is still ringing in my room and yours right here and now. And that's because of the event character of the natural world. So that's been another major transition that still has not been made in the thinking of most modern intellectuals, in my view. Okay. And it's a very important one. It'll change everything once we see the universe as made up of events or happenings.
So to say that all is flux does not do justice to the depth of the claim here. On the other hand, that's in keeping with the spirit of it.
It is flowing, but the flow has a kind of texture to it, whereby each present moment takes into itself the events that have happened in the past and hands them off, as it were, to the next event and so forth. So it's not just a continuous flow, it's one that's very highly nuanced and therefore has a kind of beauty to it that we don't recognize if we look upon it as just continuous.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I want to bring in one more subject just to kind of situate your argument in the landscape of arguments like this. Now, on the one hand, this is not just you're not just making an argument about Christian theology here. You're making an argument about the place of religion, broadly speaking.
Yes, broadly speaking.
And so I guess you're viewing non-Christian religions as being vehicles of revelation, very much as you would say Christianity is.
Well, I would say that the unity of religions, I have a whole chapter on this today, is best thought of as are all sharing in an anticipation of rightness. None of us have possession of it, but we can join arms and not have to argue and fight so much if we realize that we can all contribute to the awakening of the universe. And this is why I'm very appreciative of Buddhism and Hinduism and native religions and others. And I want to approach them in terms of what each of them can contribute to this awakening and that others might not be able to do so. Yeah. I'm Christian myself, but I want to have a very generous a way of relating to and learning from what other traditions, not just religions, but science also tells me about the world.
Okay, but at the same time, there's another tradition that wants to, in some ways, similarly, well, not unify the religious traditions, but I'm thinking of perennialism. So perennialism attributes valid insight to all the religions, but it does so in a way that you don't buy, which is it views them all
in
as
a way that's contradictory to the scientific worldview today. It talks about a revelation that took place in the past, and that's pre-scientific. I mean, perennialism is a way of summarizing some of the attributes, the qualities, the teachings of many, many different traditions. And it idealizes a primordial revelation, usually, which took place either in the historical past long ago or in some extra mundane event that revealed itself to the world. And then over the course of time, that has gotten messed up. So the purpose of perennial religion is to take us back through the stream to the fountainhead of it all. The image they use is a mountain where many different rivers are flowing down from the top of the mountain from some common fountainhead, and all these rivers are okay because each one of them, you don't have to be converted to Buddhism or Hinduism. Stay in your own tradition and follow it back upstream to where it came from, and you will end up arriving at a point of agreement with where you would arrive at if you followed another stream up there.
Right.
But all that's based upon a cosmology which is very, very difficult for educated people to embrace today. I suppose you could still make sense of it in some figurative or metaphorical sense, but I don't think you have to. I think what we can do now is look at religions as part of an unfinished universe, as a vital part of it, that carry on the cosmic process, the cosmic story, which has always been anticipatory. But after consciousness has awakened, it can be more explicitly anticipatory of rightness, of beauty, of goodness and truth. And that all of our religions can contribute to that anticipation. We can share in that anticipatory awakening of the cosmos, rather than squabbling over who has the primordial revelation best articulated.
So I assume you don't mind the metaphor of people of different religions maybe climbing the same mountain from different sides. It's just that at the top, they're not trying to recover something that was lost at the top. They're striving toward genuinely new insight that is unified. There's one top.
Yeah,
but
and this is the way most people are not scientifically educated. So this is the way most people, in some way or another, this perennialist view is part of religions worldwide, and is still the dominant way of looking for the ideal in world religions today. But all I'm saying is that now that some of us have become aware of this cosmic story, we can arrive at the same and even a more enhanced understanding of ultimate reality if we look upon it as something that's approaching the universe from the future.
Okay, so speaking of the cosmic story, the name of the book is The New Cosmic Story, Inside Our Awakening Universe, by you, John Haught. Is there any place else you would send people for information about your work or anything?
A lot of people know me from my book, God After Darwin, which you mentioned earlier. And in August, there will be a John Haught reader that will be coming out that sort of recapitulates a lot of stuff that I've done over the years. One of the, I guess the book that has been most popular, and the one that I would recommend people, first of all, is a book called What is God? And I developed some of the ideas in there that I've carried further in The New Cosmic Story.
Okay. Well, thank you. Congratulations on the book, and congratulations on having a reader. Few people can say they have a reader. I mean, they may have a reader in the sense of someone reading their book, but they don't get a whole book as a reader.
That's right.
And they may not even have one person reading their book either.
That's right. I might even read it myself.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, John.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Thanks for the conversation.
My pleasure.